Hello, I'm Fred Paul, an application engineer with Eaton Corporation. Our topic today is seismic qualified equipment. Please remember that this is a basic, general overview of the subject. At the end of the presentation, I will direct you as to where you can find more detailed information. The points of interest and questions answered will be: how realistic is the need for seismic qualified equipment in your area? What are the applicable codes and standards? How to certify equipment to be seismic qualified? Why is site-specific design required? And why proper equipment installation is so critical. So let's start our discussion by considering just how real is the threat of seismic activity in your area and the need for seismic qualified equipment. First, one needs to overcome any bias that this is just a California thing. So we would like to encourage a broader viewpoint and thinking on the matter, and here is why. If one thinks from a national perspective, we begin to see the bigger picture, as it were. This map is from the U.S. Geological Survey website with a prediction for the horizontal spectral response acceleration for a 0.2 second period with a 2% probability of exceedance in 50 years. As can be seen from this map, the possibility for a seismic event is real for most parts of the United States. These events may even occur in areas that we might think of as small-town America, such as this event in West Salem, Illinois. Notice, it is not if, but when this event will happen. As shown here, seismic experts predict that the Midwest is scheduled to have at least a 6.0 earthquake. Extended areas around the New Madrid Fault area are also expected to suffer from widespread damage. It is interesting to note that the damage would be due to the fact that the buildings are not constructed to current seismic standards. If the buildings and infrastructure in these areas are not engineered to be earthquake resistant, how much more so the non-structural equipment contained therein? Thus the need for seismic qualified equipment nationally. We can enlarge our perspective on this from this seismic activity map from the United States Geological Survey, or USGS, that the same could be said for many places around the globe. A note of further interest, not only the quantity of earthquakes has increased, but also the severity and magnitude, causing increased loss of life and property damage. However, we are learning from history. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake caused an increased focus on designing buildings and infrastructure to resist seismic forces and minimize damage. But what about the equipment in the building? Damage to the contents of a building, or the non-structural items, rather than the building structure itself, can be more costly. This is especially true depending on risk to human life and systems downtime. This loss grows in magnitude when the building is a critical operations center, such as a hospital or healthcare facility, telecommunications center, police department, fire department, disaster shelters, and so forth. Thus, we can readily appreciate the need for seismic qualified electrical equipment. You may wonder, what does seismic qualified really mean? By definition, it is documentation that confirms the reliability of electrical equipment after a seismic event, that the equipment will be structurally sound and operational to perform as designed and intended. So now let's consider what codes and standards applied for equipment to bear the distinction seismic qualified. We at Eaton appreciate that with the multitude of building codes and standards, it can be confusing. Which one applies to your area? Is it the IBC, the International Building Code, or the CBC, the California Building Code? Maybe it's the UBC, the Uniform Building Code, or perhaps the BOCA, the Building Officials and Code Administrators. So let's take a look and figure it out, starting with the last one, BOCA. When you research BOCA on the internet, you will eventually be redirected to the International Code Council, or ICC, website with this message. Therefore, BOCA is now part of the ICC. Thus, referencing BOCA or its published standards would not be appropriate or applicable to today's seismic requirements. So we see BOCA would not apply. So now let's take a look at the UBC, or Uniform Building Code. Similar to BOCA, the UBC no longer exists as a code-making body with published standards, 1997 being the last edition that their standards were published. However, the UBC legacy lived on, with the UBC standard being the basis for the 2000 International Building Code, or IBC, and by extension, the 2001 California Building Code, or CBC. Thus, referencing UBC or its published standards would also not be appropriate or applicable for today's seismic requirements. So if it is not the UBC, what about the CBC? The CBC, or California Building Code, is a state-specific building standards code which is published by the California Building Standards Commission. But you may be wondering, what is the basis for this code and its subsequent published standards? Previously, it was based on the 1997 UBC up until the year 2001. But time and technology move on, as well as the understanding of seismic events. Thus, the California Building Standards Commission had a dilemma, since the UBC no longer existed and its standards were becoming outdated. Therefore, they had to move forward and go to the UBC's new home, the International Building Code, or IBC. But what edition of the IBC did they select? The California Building Standards Commission had no other alternative than to base the latest edition of the CBC on the latest, or 2006 edition of the IBC as the parent code. But are there any differences in the two standards and published codes? Yes. Let's see why there are differences and why caution must be exercised. First, the CBC is not a word-for-word adoption of the IBC. The IBC is used as a model, and therefore there are amendments to the IBC standards contained in the CBC. Secondly, local authorities having jurisdiction, or AHJs, can amend the CBC, but only if the amendments are more restrictive than the CBC. Therefore, always check with the local AHJ to confirm the applicable local seismic standards. We will talk about other states utilizing the IBC and their respective AHJs in a minute. Another major difference in the CBC, when compared with the IBC, has to do with what is called the seismic design category. The CBC is more restrictive by imposing Category D as the minimum design criteria allowed. Other exceptions found in the CBC is the allowance of analysis for seismic certification on active electrical equipment, whereas in the IBC, Section 13.2.2, it only allows testing and experience as the only approved methods. Therefore, for California, the conclusion of the applicable code and standard is the 2001 CBC, based on the 1997 UBC, is replaced by the 2007 CBC, which is based on the 2006 IBC. The CBC publication date was July 1st, 2007, and the effective date was January 1st, 2008. You might be thinking that might be fine if you're in California, but what about the rest of the country? That is where the IBC comes into play. The IBC is an organization comprised by the consolidation of BOCA, the ICBO, and the SBCCI. Thus, the three model code organizations were combined to provide development of codes without regional limitations. What has been the effect of this action? Increased safety, applicable code clarity, with resulting economic benefits to local communities. With this in mind, you may wonder, how many states have adopted the IBC? The number currently stands at 46, and therefore your state is probably included in that number, and therefore you are under the codes and standards of the IBC. However, your state may have adopted the IBC as a standard to ensure public safety, but may not be enforcing it to the fullest degree when it comes to seismic qualified equipment, as we shall soon demonstrate. Thus, for most of the United States, the IBC would be the appropriate code to reference for today's seismic requirements. However, a word of caution: always check with your local AHJ as to what code is enforced in your local community. Many of the major metropolitan areas such as Chicago, San Francisco, and New York City have their own set of unique codes and standards that may differ from the IBC regulations. Since the IBC is the parent document that most local codes are modeled from, let's now take a look at some highlights of that code and its impact on seismic qualified equipment. First, the IBC makes it very clear in section 1613.1 that the structure and the components contained therein, such as electrical and mechanical equipment, which are permanently attached to the structure, shall resist the effects of motion created by an earthquake. Then we are referenced to ASCE 7, which is published by the American Society of Civil Engineers. The most current edition of ASCE is 7-05. This information was previously incorporated into the 2003 IBC, but now is a separate standalone document. ASCE 7-05, section 13.2, is very specific that non-structural equipment shall be seismic qualified regardless of the state or locality. This is where we get closer to the requirement for seismic qualified equipment certification. Note that electrical components, supports, and attachments shall comply by one of the following methods. With reference to electrical components, supports, and attachments, we begin to realize that this is a system comprising two or more of these elements, and that by nature requires the involvement of a structural design professional and is beyond the scope and responsibility of the manufacturer alone. However, when we scrutinize the two authorized methods that follow, it would seem to imply something different. Here, under Method 1, we are introduced to the concept of project-specific design, or sometimes referred to as site-specific design. Note that this responsibility falls on the registered design professional, that is the civil and/or structural engineer. However, Method 2 allows for manufacturer certification by one of three qualifying procedures, which we will discuss in more detail momentarily. At this time, it would be prudent to note, as stated earlier, that although the IBC, by reference to ASCE 7, allows for either method number 1 or number 2, the reality is that most states and localities require that any structural documentation, such as the manufacturer certificate, be verified by a locally registered design professional, or PE. In Method 1, the design professional would need the seismic documentation from the manufacturer of the equipment to ascertain that it meets or exceeds the site-specific design criteria. Thus, for either method, the foundation of the process is the manufacturer's certificate of seismic qualification. Therefore, let's look at what method number 1 really means.